I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're working. A lot of that mediation and dispute resolution activity that was referenced there was working with Aboriginal communities, so it's an important acknowledgement. Okay. So just a quick snapshot of Victoria. Many of you might be aware that Victoria is probably a year or two ahead of New South Wales in terms of that overarching statewide strategic planning required for waste and resource recovery infrastructure. I'll let you read those figures at your leisure. There's some things that Victoria probably has done that New South Wales and other jurisdictions are building on. There is certainly a lot that we can learn from other jurisdictions too, not the least of which I'm incredibly jealous of the amount of money being splashed around in New South Wales in the waste and resource recovery field. So our statewide waste and resource recovery infrastructure plan was released in 2015. It represents a significant amount of work undertaken by a couple of the key environmental portfolio agencies in Victoria, primarily Sustainability Victoria and the 7 regional waste and resource recovery groups that we have down south, as well as the Environmental Protection Authority. So we've got a sort of a slightly more diversified sort of environmental agency model. So the statewide plan really takes a long-term 30-year view about what are the infrastructure needs in waste and resource recovery in Victoria, and really drives an integrated planning approach. So that not just looking at it at the statewide level, but really bringing together what we know at a local and a regional level. It does have a high-level vision, which is effectively that we have an integrated statewide waste and resource recovery system that provides an essential community service to protect the community, environment and public health, to recover valuable resources from waste, and to minimise long-term costs to household, industry and governments. A couple of key words to pick out of that that's important. I think in Victoria at the moment there is a very strong emphasis on concepts of environmental justice, on ensuring that that all aspects of the Victorian community benefit from environmental investment equally, but also share the burden of environmental action equally. Like many big cities, we have sort of an uneven balance in Melbourne around where our waste and resource recovery infrastructure is located. Particularly some of our western suburbs of Melbourne currently sort of shoulder the burden of carrying a lot of the waste and resource recovery infrastructure, whereas a lot of the leafier eastern suburbs of Melbourne seem to be very comfortable shipping their waste elsewhere. And so a key thrust of the statewide plan is about over that 30-year period, providing all Victorians and all Victorian communities with equal access to waste and resource recovery infrastructure. The other key thing in there is about public health. There's a broader context to this going on. The Victorian Environmental Protection Act is over 40 years old. And is in fact one of the first environmental protection authority, in fact the second environmental protection authority in the world. And when the Andrews Labor government came to power in Victoria, they committed to an independent inquiry to review the EPA and its operations. That inquiry has delivered its findings to government. Government announced its response to that inquiry in January of this year. And is investing significantly in improved environmental regulation in Victoria to position the EPA as a modern environmental regulator going forward. And in particular, that has a very strong emphasis on concepts of public health and environmental health. The EPA will no longer just be an environmental regulator, it will be a sort of a public health regulator as well. We're not just regulating sort of environmental impacts for the sake of the environment, very much putting Victorian communities at the centre of that. So the statewide plan is the first of its kind in Australia. It will be supported by 7 regional plans, and you can see the colours of those 7 regions there. The Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Implementation Plan is the first of those to be finalised. It was released in October of last year. And the finalisation of the 6 other regional plans is very much imminent. I was hoping I could stand up here today and let you know they'd been finalised. They're in the Minister's office and awaiting finalisation. So within the next month or two, we will certainly see those out the door. When I talk about the statewide plan, which we lovingly refer to as the SWRP, being refreshed in 2017, the legislative process is that once those regional plans come online, we do need to go back and look at that statewide plan and just make sure that the statewide plan and the regional plans are truly integrated, that they truly talk to each other. So it's not a wholesale root and branch review of a 30-year planning document. It's about some minor tweaks. What else can I tell you? Why do we need a statewide plan? I think the previous session sort of covered off on some of that quite adequately. Obviously, Victoria's population continues to grow. There are population density issues which are changing the ways in which Victorians live, the way in which they consume, the way in which they generate waste. Victorian waste is generated to rise significantly. Our landfill capacity is not infinite. We understand that landfill has significant impacts on local communities, on local environments, on public health, and we are not recovering all of the valuable resources that we should be doing. The statewide plan is informed by that kind of granular level of data collection that the previous presentation talked about as being currently underway in New South Wales. So a lot of data collection from the Environmental Protection Authority, from the industry sector, from local governments, and similarly those regional plans that are about to be finalised have an even further level of granularity to the data that underpins that. What I will say just in passing is a lot of that data collection has resulted in a really good resource which just last month Sustainability Victoria has uploaded onto its website for the world to see and use. So if you're not familiar with that and you're interested in the state of play around data streams in Victoria at quite a granular level, it's up there online. The SWRP has 4 main goals. I'll touch on those briefly. The first is obviously about reducing our reliance on landfills. There's likely to be a place for landfills in Victoria for some time, but we need to work with the community to reduce that reliance on landfill and to take sort of actions and interventions in order to drive that. One of the things the plan does then is build on that data collection to include the kind of long-term projections about what is the landfill need in Victoria, and has largely come to the conclusion, and the regional plans will support this, that for a 10-year horizon at least, no new landfills are required as long as certain other actions are taken. So we've been very clear that landfills are really only there for receiving and treating waste streams from which all valuable and useful materials have been extracted. And what's important is, I think when I talked about that data gathering exercise and that combination of statewide and regional planning, is that we've had a consistent statewide process for gathering that data, a consistent statewide process for assessing the need for landfills at a statewide and regional level, and a consistent statewide process for scheduling and planning any new landfills. The second goal of the SWRP is about encouraging resource recovery and recycling through the consolidation and aggregation of our waste. There's a range of programs that sit underneath that, and I don't have time to go into those in detail. A couple of them are referenced up there. These are sort of actions that sit under the statewide plan. There is a significant amount of market development work being undertaken by Sustainability Victoria to try to encourage the creation of new markets for particular waste streams. The waste and resource recovery groups are working with their constituent local councils to drive collaborative procurement of waste and using that purchasing power, if you like, to drive good resource recovery outcomes and to try to divert waste away from landfill. And there are some links between that goal and some programs around trying to better reflect the importance of waste as an essential service in Victoria's planning provisions. And the statewide plan has now been officially incorporated into the Victorian planning provisions as at the 31st of March this year. So those goals and directions are very much sort of front of mind for planners. There is a lot more that can be done to develop some good planning tools to give effect to some of the directions in that, and that's a longer term bit of work that will play out. The third goal of the SWRP is to raise the standard of waste and resource recovery facilities with an emphasis on improving their performance. This is an action that's chiefly led by Sustainability Victoria, but obviously with strong input from our Environmental Protection Authority around issues around sort of setting appropriate standards and investing in infrastructure upgrades. I said earlier I'm a little jealous of the amount of cash being splashed around in New South Wales. We're nowhere near those figures in Victoria. I'll touch on those in a minute, but a lot of the emphasis in our investment in waste and resource recovery is very much around infrastructure upgrades to bring them up to a common standard and to expand things like our network of transfer stations in Victoria. The fourth and final goal of the SWRP is about improving the evidence base for decision making. I've touched already on a lot of the data collection process. I won't dwell on that one, but other than to note that again, the better data we have, the greater we can influence planning and land use decisions. So we're building that evidence base and continuing to do that. So in terms of implementation of the SWRP, there's a lot of work underway in particular streams and particular projects and actions. Strong emphasis on waste education at all levels. Ongoing work to improve the quality and accessibility of data. We're doing, Sustainability Victoria is going to trial some novel approaches to, things like, landfill audits and other things. I talked about investment in new infrastructure, stimulating and supporting markets, improving the recovery of organics is a particular focus in Victoria, and I've touched on collaborative procurement already. The regional implementation plans that are about to be finalised, as I said, sort of take a more local level look at what are the infrastructure requirements over the next 10 years. They are very much informed by the statewide plan, the overarching sort of strategic directions, applying that at a local level, but working with local communities, local industries, local councils to understand what are the pressure points and issues in their communities, and then adopting a consistent approach to assessing the infrastructure needs at that regional level. And once they are finalised, there will be a short period of realignment, of looking again at the statewide plan and realigning those. One of the main thrusts of the statewide plan that's worth referencing is a hubs and spokes model. It's a concept that's familiar to many of you. Basically what we've done is identified sort of groups of facilities or particular locales that manage key waste and material streams, and they have become, if you like, sites of particular importance to Victoria's waste and resource recovery infrastructure. And the spokes are really the sequence of activities that draw waste into those areas or distribute recovered products back out again. It's a useful planning tool to help guide long-term strategic investment in infrastructure needs, and in particular linking into broader issues of land use planning around road and freight transport, rail transport and so on. There's two other things I want to quickly touch on in terms of developments in Victoria. Before I do that, I'll just pause there around the statewide plan and reference that in sort of what I can share with you. Wasn't able to do it in the time to pull the slides together, but in yesterday's Victorian state budget, there was some new significant expanded investment in waste and resource recovery infrastructure. Again, not in the same category as the New South Wales expenditure, but sort of an expansion on previous years. And a very strong component of that is around investment in infrastructure. So an expansion of a resource recovery infrastructure fund that Sustainability Victoria administers. Significant investment in the government's election commitment to get e-waste or to ban e-waste from landfill, and I'll talk about that election commitment in just a moment, with a strong emphasis on the infrastructure needs to give effect to that ban. And that's where I talked about earlier about the expansion of the transfer station network, the upgrades of transfer stations, the upgrades of the collection and facilities and so on. So I will just touch briefly on the e-waste ban. The Andrews Labor government came to power with this as an election commitment. Obviously aware that, we're all aware that it's a growing waste stream with particular issues around not only valuable materials but also potentially hazardous materials. We've done a lot of consultation with industry, with local government, with broader community groups about what that ban might look like, what will it need to cover. how it might be administered, how do we minimise the adverse impacts of illegal dumping and so on. We've taken a lot of that information and intelligence and have started developing a waste management policy under our Environmental Protection Act, which will give effect to the ban. We're expecting to have a first draft of that waste management policy and a legislative impact assessment sort of released by the middle of this year, with a view to the ban being in place in 2018. It's probably fair to say that with the ban in place from 2018, there will be a graduated approach to compliance and how we work on that. And the other thing I just wanted to quickly touch on is an increasing interest from the Victorian Government and our Environment Minister, who also happens to be our Energy Minister, in the opportunities around waste to energy in Victoria. We are doing some early work with, to provide some policy development work and some advice to the Minister about what are the opportunities for waste to energy in Victoria, understanding that it has the opportunity to grow jobs and investment in Victoria. It has the opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It has the opportunity to divert waste from landfill, but that there are also some very significant consequences that we need to think through and consider, include in terms of still needing to prioritise resource recovery for perhaps higher values, and thinking about the role of waste to energy in the waste hierarchy. And what are the sort of different tools and levers at the Victorian Government's disposal if they want to encourage that. So that'll be a focus over the coming 12 months, and I would fully anticipate that if somebody is standing up here from Victoria in 12 months' time, you might see some further announcements in next year's budget around waste to energy there. I think I'm out of time. I'm happy to take one question potentially, or yeah.